In 1945, Korea was finally liberated from Japanese rule. You'd think that would be a time for celebration, right? But what followed wasn't unity. It was complete chaos. Today, we're going to dig into how a single policy, a massive land reform, became this quiet, unseen battlefield that would basically decide the fate of the entire Korean peninsula. You know, a really powerful way to think about Korea's liberation in August 1945 isn't as some simple victory. It's more like a Pandora's box. It was this gift that everyone had waited decades for. But when they finally opened it, well, instead of pure joy, it unleashed this wave of unexpected chaos all across the nation. So what did this chaos actually look like on the ground? Well, historians have a name for this period, the liberation space. And let me tell you, it was anything but unified. It was a time of incredibly intense and often violent ideological conflict. Yeah, this really wasn't a time for parades and celebration. As soon as the harsh, top-down order of Japanese rule collapsed, it created this massive political vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed a tsunami of division and conflict that just washed over the entire peninsula. And, as these fractures started to spread through society, one really prominent intellectual saw it all coming. He issued this stark and, frankly, deeply pessimistic prophecy about where Korea was headed. And get this wasn't just some private thought he scribbled in a journal. Yoon Chi-ho, who was a leading intellectual at the time, sent this warning directly to key independence leaders like Kim Gu and Syngman Rhee. He sent it right as liberation was dawning. He was basically pleading with them to unite because he feared this inevitable disaster was just around the corner. His warning really boiled down to three core fears. First, he believed Korea's location was a geopolitical curse, making it a pawn for bigger powers. Second, he was worried that the public just wasn't ready for self-governance after decades of occupation. And third, and this was maybe the most spot on, he feared that crippling infighting between political factions would tear the new nation apart before it even had a chance to stand on its own 2 feet. And here's the thing. This tension didn't just stay at the level of debate and arguments. Oh no. It quickly erupted into actual violent conflict, turning that intellectual's warning into a tragic reality. A really critical turning point came just 2 months, only 2 months, after the Republic of Korea was formally established. The Yasu Suncheon incident showed that this ideological war was no longer just a political debate. It had become an armed conflict inside the new state's own military. So the crucial point here is that the liberation space had totally morphed into an internal battleground. These uprisings weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a very real, concerted effort to undermine the new government and reshape the entire peninsula under a communist model. Okay, so if you're the new government under Syngman Rhee, what do? You're faced with this intense internal strife, and you know that communism's biggest appeal is to a population of poor farmers. So you roll out a really radical policy, one aimed at completely reshaping the very foundation of the nation's economy and its social structure. So here's how it worked, and this was actually written into the very first constitution. The principle was paid purchase, paid distribution. Now, this wasn't a seizure of land. The government bought the excess land from large landlords, and then it sold that land to the tenant farmers who worked it, letting them pay for it over time. The goal was simple but huge: dismantle the old feudal system and create a brand new nation of land-owning farmers. Now, to really understand just how massive this change was, you have to look at this number, 65%. Before the reform, nearly 2/3 of all farmland was cultivated by tenant farmers who just paid rent to landlords. They had zero ownership themselves. This was a gigantic source of social and economic instability. And the outcome? It was absolutely dramatic. Tenant farming, which had literally defined rural life for centuries, was pretty much eliminated. It plummeted from 65% of all farmland down to just 8%. I mean, in just a few years, the entire social fabric of the country was fundamentally rewired. But here's the thing. This economic reform wasn't just some domestic policy to keep people happy. It was a critical, strategic move in the larger ideological conflict with the North, a conflict that was about to explode into all-out war. And this is where you can see the two Koreas diverging completely. Up in the north, land was seized from landlords and given to farmers, but, and this is a big but, it ultimately belonged to the state.
In the South, the entire model was designed to create a huge class of private property owners. This wasn't just a small policy difference, it was a fundamental clash of philosophies about how a country should work.
This is exactly why the land reform can be seen as a strategic masterstroke. Think about it. It gave the majority of the population, the farmers, a real, tangible stake in the new republic. It secured their loyalty, it built a foundation on private property, and maybe most importantly, it took away the single biggest grievance that communist propaganda was using to win people over.
And this leads us to a really powerful conclusion. The land reform wasn't just a policy. It was, and I quote, a decisive, invisible trigger in the long-term conflict between the two Koreas. It was a winning move that was made before the shooting war even began.
So this leaves us with a final and I think crucial question. By transforming millions of tenants into landowners, did this 1949 reform build the very foundation that allowed South Korea to survive its most vulnerable moments? The argument we've explored today makes a really compelling case that it did, reshaping an entire nation, one plot of land at a time.